Horror as a genre is generally based around a thrill of something terrifying, some kind of force that drives characters into life or death situations. Despite cinema only existing for a little over a century, it has revolutionized both the horror genre and the monsters that star in them, but it wasn't always like that. Horror films are somewhat hard to pin down and where exactly they started, with some examples going as far back as 1896, and they followed certain formulas. Cinema didn't necessarily have its own identity yet, so filmmakers relied on adapting stories from other mediums to try to get people into theater seats, with the most popular horror films being adaptations of already existing stories. In the span of 10 years, there were 3 different Dracula adaptations, with Dracula's Death, Nosferatu, and the famous 1931 Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. These films are still under strict guidelines of self-censorship due to the Hays Code that spelled out what American filmmakers were and weren't allowed to do. I bet you didn't know, in Frankenstein's most famous scene, the line was originally, "Now I know what it feels like to be God," but several state censorship boards found the line to be blasphemous, so they changed it to "It's alive."
It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Because of this, foreign horror films did most of the experimenting, most notable The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a film Roger Ebert called the first true horror film. Like most horror creatures of the time, the killer is a humanoid monster, something that is once human but is no longer. In the 1950s, after the creation of the atomic bomb and the start of the Cold War, mainstream audiences became much more scared of atomic war and nuclear radiation, and that fear is translated right into the movies. In the atomic age, every monster had something to do with nuclear radiation: giant spiders, giant ants, giant locusts, giant women, giant lizards, you name it. With the Hays Code still in place and the HUAC keeping everyone in Hollywood paranoid of which one of them is a communist, horror films rarely experimented, and movies were bound to very familiar structures. The 1960s saw a lot of changes to the Hollywood formula, as 1960s counterculture was all about breaking social norms and experimentation. This counterculture can be seen in music and especially in cinema. Most historians agree that Psycho is the film that marks the death of the Hays Code, as the shower scene alone would never have been permitted under it. But the biggest innovation in horror monsters from the 60s is no doubt from the film Night of the Living Dead. The modern conception of a zombie owes itself entirely to this 1968 film about cannibalistic reanimated corpses that attack a group of survivors barricading themselves in a farmhouse. The 70s were perhaps the most revolutionary time for Hollywood monsters, as 4 massive films changed the landscape of Hollywood monsters thereafter. Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween were both very low budget, where the monster wasn't an alien or an unholy beast, but rather another human. There were also both movies that ushered in a new subgenre of horror called slasher films, where they both involved a cast of characters being killed off by a villain one by one. The Exorcist was one of the biggest financial successes of the decade and of all time, and was preceded by a long line of occult films that are still pretty popular today. But the biggest change in Hollywood monsters came from the 1979 film Alien. Ridley Scott was incredibly impressed with the illustrations done by a surrealist painter named H.R. Giger and was brought on set to create the monster of his new film, Alien. As we've seen up until this point, monsters in cinema are typically earthbound creatures of one kind or another, but with the creation of the Xenomorph, H.R. Giger and Ridley Scott made something that truly felt not of this world. The Xenomorph was such a success that now every alien looks like it was made by H.R. Giger. The 80s and 90s made heavy advancements in technology, but no film of this period influenced the genre as a whole as much as the 70s did, and the most popular horror monsters of this period were influenced by horror films of before. Horror films have generally been massively successful despite tiny budgets. Modern horror filmmakers have found unique ways to make monsters scary despite low budgets. The most notable example can be found in the found footage subgenre that the Blair Witch Project started and the Paranormal Activity films popularized. These films are made with basically no budgets, and suspense is built around what you can't see versus what you do. You will never see the Blair Witch nor the demonic entity in Paranormal Activity, but you're horrified by their presence nonetheless. Movies seem to be taking a break at the moment, so we'll see what's to come of Hollywood horror monsters afterwards.